Hi everyone, it's Darlene. Welcome back for another card video. In today's card, I'm going to be blending multi-step stamps. I'm using this Picture Perfect set by Stampin' Up. I'm going to use the rose and the hummingbird. I'm going to start by showing you, here are the three parts to the rose, and you can see there's an arrow on each one of these stamps, and as long as you put those in the right direction every time, you'll get perfectly aligned stamps. I'm using Canson XL watercolor paper. It's called Mixed Media. It's a bright white color, and that's why I love it. And I'm using watercolor paper because of the blending that we're going to be doing. And I'm also using distress inks because they blend well. So my first ink here is worn lipstick. So I've got my first stamp on the paper. And you can see because of the texture of the watercolor paper, it kind of leaves this kind of white areas inside where the color is. So I'm just taking an aqua painter and I'm just going over the worn lipstick areas to blend that out to a nice smooth color. Then I'll clean off my aqua painter, and you can see I'm going to cover some of the white areas. Now I think that this is what kind of tends to make these multi-step stamps look a little less realistic, is there's a little too much white, at least with this set. And so what I'm going to do is cover some of the white, but not all of the white. I do want to leave a little thin line for a reflection, but this is going to give me a whole another color, so a lighter worn lipstick, which is going to add more dimension to my flower. Next, I'm going to do step 2 here, and I've got this lined up. I'm going to use Barn Door Distress ink. So I'm going to ink that up and stamp it down. And you can see I have less of a stamp now because I started with my largest one. And again, you can see with the texture of the paper that I don't get a nice smooth color. So I'm going to take my aqua painter and blend this out. I'm doing the same thing I did with the worn lipstick. So I'm just covering the barn door, except the only thing that I'm doing differently is that I'm also blending the edge of the barn door where it meets the worn lipstick. So it looks like those two colors blend and there's not a line between them. So I'm really actually looking at the lines of the ink and not so much at the flower itself, trying to develop a shape. I'm just following the stamp itself. It's also a good idea to let these layers dry in between so you don't get too much of the blending. So now that I've finished barn door, I'm going to move on to my third step. And I've got that lined up, and for this one I'm using Fired Brick, just another darker shade of red. And I'm going to stamp that down, and this is primarily on the lower right hand side of this rose. And again, I'm just going to take my aqua painter and do the same thing I did in the last two steps. I like to be methodical when I'm doing these things. And I'm just going to cover over the fired brick with water. Now keep in mind, I don't have any color on my brush. I'm just blending out the fired brick so it doesn't look like I have a bunch of lines that were on my stamp, and they just sort of all blend together. So I'm just putting some water on top of those areas and then blending it in a little bit to the barn door. After I was done doing this, I thought I wanted to get rid of a little bit more of the white, so I cleaned off my brush a little bit to make sure that I just had water. And I'm going to go over some of those white areas and cover up some of the white because I don't want it to be too bright, but I do want there to be some hint of a reflection. The next step is to just add a little bit of detail. I've got a barn door distress marker here, so it matches my middle color. This step is actually optional. You don't have to do this, but I felt like I wanted a little more contrast on the upper left side of the flower where my fired brick did not stamp. So I took the barn door, so I didn't want to go with the fired brick because I felt like it was a little bit too dark, a little bit too brown. I just wanted a little more hint of shadow. So I took my marker and I just went over the edge of the petal so that I was coloring on the petal behind it, right behind it. And so I colored it with a marker, then used my aqua painter to blend it outward. So you can see wherever there's white, I'm going next to it. I'm going to be sure not to color over that white, but it looks like I'm coloring behind the white, and that's going to make that white petal that has the reflection on it that appears to be in front pop up just a little bit more, so you can see a distinction between the front petals and the back petals. And again, this technique is going to work really well with distress inks because they activate with water. So even though I have it laid down on the paper, I may have waited a little while, but it's going to reactivate once I put water on it, and it's going to really blend those colors nicely together. All right, I'm done with this touch-up except for the center. I decided to add a little bit more shadow since it's going to be kind of the middle where a lot of the petals are shadowing. So I wanted a little bit more dark area there. So this is the Artful Flower Set by Simon Says Stamp. I needed a stem, and so this one seemed like a good size. I'm going to mask the flower so I don't stamp over it, and I've curved my stamp a little bit onto an acrylic block. I'm going to ink it up with some peeled paint, and I'm using the solid one, by the way. There's a solid and then there's an outline for this stem. So I'm going to stamp the solid with peeled paint, and then I want to add a little bit of dimension here. So I'm going to take a forest moss marker, and I'm going to take my brush tip and I'm going to draw a little bit underneath the flower because I'm going to have a shadow from the flower, and then down the edge of the stem on the left hand side. Then I'll blend that out with my aqua painter. And then I decided I didn't get really enough blending, so I just put some of the marker on my craft mat and picked it up with my aqua painter and pulled that color out a little bit more to the right. Next, I'm going to stamp the leaves. There's one multi-step leaf in this set. I'm going to do the first layer, the largest, with bundled sage. It's a light green. I'm going to hang it off the bottom here because I don't want it to be too distracting. And then I'm going to do the next layer in peeled paint. Notice I'm not blending with my aqua painter because these stamps are pretty small. I'm not too worried about it. It's not my focal point. The third color is Forest Moss, the same color I used on the highlights of the stem. And once I get all three of them stamped, I'm going to take an aqua painter and I'm just going to make sure that I don't have any lines in there. I'm not going to go over it too much. I just want to get rid of some of those white areas. I don't want to eliminate the texture. And then I went ahead and stamped it again on the right hand side of the stem, and it's kind of off the paper mostly. All right, now for my hummingbird. You'll find that the colors that I'm using for the hummingbird are very far apart, so the blending really makes a huge difference when I'm stamping these stamps here. My first layer is antique linen. So I'm going to do the same technique I used with the flower. So I'm going to take my aqua painter. I don't have any color on it. I'm just blending over this bird so that it doesn't look like it's textured because of the texture of the paper. So I'm just making a nice smooth color across the whole thing. And where there's an edge to my antique linen, I'm going to blend it out. So I'm going to slow it down here for a second. You can see I pulled the antique linen a little further up than I wanted. I don't want to cover too much of the white. Now it will be covered by some of the subsequent stamps that are part of this image. But I'm going to go back and blend that where I had pulled it out into the white. Just kind of fade it into the white a little bit better. All right, my next step is going to be barn door, and this is the throat of the hummingbird. So it's a really small stamp. So I'm going to ink it up and stamp it down here, and now you can see that I was a little off with the stamp. It was kind of hard to see where I had stamped the antique linen since it's such a light color. But no problem here with the multi-step stamps. They all kind of stamp on top of each other, so you're never going to notice this. But I'm pulling the ink up to cover up the area that I didn't stamp on, that kind of left a gap there. And that, again, is the beauty of the distress inks, is that if you make a mistake, you can just blend it all together. Next layer is peeled paint. So now I'm going with green, which is the typical body of a hummingbird, a male hummingbird anyway. And so I'm going to stamp this down. Now you'll see when I lift it up that it looks kind of fake. And that's what I don't like about some of the multi-step stamps. So you can just make this so much smoother and prettier and more dimensional by just taking an aqua painter. Again, no color on it. I'm just blending out the peeled paint that just got stamped and kind of pulling it up a little bit, but not too far, and just moving it around so that you don't see any of the stamp lines and you don't see the texture of the paper underneath. Now the distress ink, and I think I've mentioned this, is not really a stamping ink, but it's great for getting color on your paper and then moving it around. So you can see I'm just kind of blending around the head. I'm going to be careful not to touch the eye because there is some white in there. I want to preserve that. And you can see that even the wing didn't really have too much stamped on it, especially on the top of the wing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull some of that green color out toward the edge of the wing so that I get a little bit more of a smooth transition of color. Now I'm not going to cover all of the antique linen. I'm going to leave some of it plain, but I just want to make it look a little bit more realistic by doing this. I just want to quickly show you that lining up the stamps is pretty easy. Just make sure that you have the head and the tail aligned, and then everything else should line up. My last layer is walnut stain. So this is another completely different, much darker color. So I'm going to be really careful to make sure it gets lined up. And then you can see it really adds so much more dimension by having this dark shadowy color. And again, same thing that I've been doing every time, just going over the walnut stain with my aqua painter. No more color, so no additional color. I'm just moving the color that's already on the cardstock around. I'm going to blend it a little bit outward, but I have to be careful with the walnut stain because it is a pretty dark color. So I'm just going to go over this pretty lightly, move it up a little bit and along the edge. But honestly, all I'm doing is moving the color around so that you can't see the lines of the stamp. So not too much work with the walnut stain. Just like I did with the flower, I am going to have one detail step here. For the hummingbird, I'm going to take my Copic liner, my 0.3, and I'm going to draw over the eye, the pupil of the eye, so that it just really pops out. Because it was stamped with the walnut stain, which is a brown color, and I really wanted it to be black. And then also I'm going to take my marker and draw a little bit outward on the beak to really define this as a really bright kind of line that pops off the paper. Not too much, just a little bit. You don't want it to be completely black, so just kind of line the edge. Finally, I'm going to stamp my sentiment in the middle. I'm using some Hero Hues black ink. I tend to use the ink that's the juiciest when I'm stamping on watercolor paper to make sure that I get a nice crisp image. And then I'm going to cut this panel back so that I have a mat of 1/8 of an inch on all sides. I'm going to put some ATG tape runner on the back and adhere it to a Hero Arts note card that's black on the outside and white on the inside. And that is the card for today. So I kept it pretty simple. I didn't want to add, I thought about adding splatters or sequins or something like that, but decided that I just wanted it to be plain and have the focal area be the focal area. So anyway, that's the card for today. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.